Well, bad news on the jobs front this week. The unemployment rate ticked higher in October to 2.3%. More worryingly, perhaps, 19,000 jobs were taken out of the market, the first fall in jobs since 2016.
Yes, after three RBA rate cuts this year and the first round of tax cuts not really showing much impact, pressure is mounting on the government to do more to stimulate the economy. I spoke to Treasurer Josh Frydenberg from Adelaide, and interestingly, he would not rule out bringing forward the second round of tax cuts. Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, great to talk to you. Now, jobs this week, unemployment back up to 5.3%. And of more concern, perhaps, the fall in the number of jobs, full and part-time. We haven't seen that for a while.
Well, let's keep these job numbers in context. We've seen over the last 12 months more than 20,000 jobs created on average each month. Since we've come to government, we've seen more than 1.4 million new jobs being created, and even after this month's results, we're seeing employment growth at 2%. Now, that compares to an OECD average of employment growth of 0.9% and a rate of 0.7% when we came to government. So yes, unemployment is 5.3%, but it was still 5.7% when we came to government. So we have created jobs. The labour market has been resilient, and there are a record number of Australians in work, particularly more women are now in work.
Even so, compared to, say, even 18 months ago, I mean, AMP's economist Shane Oliver, he talks about clearly a slowdown in the labour market now.
Well, look, there are some challenges across the economy, and no one is seeking to sidestep those. I mean, we've got some real headwinds, and I'm talking about the drought domestically, which has knocked off around 0.25% off GDP and is impacting on our manufacturing, particularly food manufacturing. We know that the global headwinds from the trade tensions between the US and China have played negatively on investment and global economic confidence, which has seen a slowdown in capital flows as well as a slowdown in the growth in trade volumes. These are all real pressures, but the point is the Australian economy remains resilient. Our budget is back in balance for the first time in 11 years. We've maintained our AAA credit rating, and the labour market remains robust and strong.
Nevertheless, how does one respond to these growing pressures? Unemployment is now moving away from the RBA target of 4.5%. Do you actually accept that rate cuts seem to be doing little to stimulate the economy and actually instead lowering business confidence and consumer confidence every time there's another cut?
Well, Tiki, you would understand that monetary policy is the domain of the Reserve Bank, and I have met regularly with the Governor and most recently also with the board in the annual lunch that we have. We know that the rate cuts have helped stabilise the property market, and that's not insignificant, together obviously with the re-election of the coalition government because people had feared a housing tax from the Labor Party. But we also know that the interest rates in Australia, while historically low, are not unique to Australia. We've seen low cash rates right across the developed economies of the world, and we've seen low inflation where 3/4 of developed economies now have an inflation rate under 2% and about a third have an inflation rate under 1%. So this is not a unique phenomenon that we're seeing here in Australia.
But the stimulus of the tax cuts that you have brought forward don't seem to be getting through and stimulating the economy. Is it time, as certainly economists like Bill Evans at Westpac might say, that you really do need to bring forward the phase 2 of your tax cuts now?
Well, we're sticking to our plan, which was laid out to the Australian people in the budget delivered in April and that we took to the election. And
so that's a no.
We successfully legislated our tax cuts through the parliament after the election, and as you know, if you're an income earner earning up to $90,000, you could take home an extra up to $1,080. Now, this is not insignificant. We've seen more than $23 billion go into the hands of Australian workers for their as refunds after their 18-19 tax return was put in, and we've seen Treasury estimate that some $8 billion will be added to disposable income as a result of these tax cuts. And you've heard from Treasury, from the RBA, that it will boost household disposable income. So these tax cuts are still flowing through the economy. We're sticking to our plan, and we'll stick to our policies that are based on our values, namely that Australians earn more and keep more of what they earn.
So if you're not going to move the tax cuts forward, do you think that the RBA will move on into quantitative easing if we continue to get these sorts of numbers coming through on the employment side?
Well, we know that the RBA has said publicly that they believe that step is highly unlikely, although, again, that is their remit and that is their domain. There is QE going on in other parts of the world. We haven't seen it here in Australia, but interest rates are historically low at 0.75%, and it's quite clear that the RBA, in their most recent decision to keep them on hold, are waiting to see, no doubt, what the September quarter national account numbers show, and to see the continued impact of our record $100 billion of infrastructure spending, as well as the tax cuts and the other reforms that we're undertaking.
You have announced this week a productivity drive with the states, the Commonwealth and the states, all rowing together, as you say. Now, is this actually a response to the New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet, just a few days ago, who was talking about calling for the states and the Fed to break the emergency glass? He talks about a six-pack of PMs came and went in the last decade. The reform lever has gathered dust, he says.
Well, this push from the Commonwealth actually predates that, because we held a Treasurers meeting where the Commonwealth and the state and territory treasurers come together. We had Michael Brennan, the head of the Productivity Commission, present to that meeting, and we talked through the Shifting the Dial report from the Productivity Commission, which lays out more than 26 proposals for cutting red tape and regulation and getting more efficiencies across the various jurisdictions. Now, 22 of those recommendations relate particularly to state responsibilities or joint federal-state responsibilities. So what we do need to do is work together. As I say, row together. And our focus is on microeconomic reform. It's on the supply side of the economy. It's on infrastructure. It's on industrial relations, deregulation, competition reforms, and, of course, this Shifting the Dial report gives us a good way forward.
Yes, and part of that, obviously, is tax reform at the state level, stamp duty, payroll, land tax. Now, my colleague, Steve Nash, recently asked Mr Perrottet about stamp duty, and he said, well, while he was open to reform, he made the rather obvious point, I think, that it has been a big revenue raiser. Were he to embark on such a big reform, would the Commonwealth support him financially to get over the hump, as it were?
Well, look, the New South Wales government, no doubt, is doing this body of work and will make its own decisions, but there is not a big bucket of federal money that is ready to be handed around. We have got tight fiscal circumstances, and we are spending record amounts on hospitals and on schools and on infrastructure, and we can see ways that we can work together to develop those productivity gains.
So we're effectively ruling out competition payments to the states from here on in?
I know they've had those before with the Hilmer reforms and the like, but there is no big bucket of money for us to hand out. What the states have at their disposal are their own revenue and spending levers, but you know, it's welcome that Dominic Perrottet in New South Wales are doing this work, giving themselves options, looking at payroll tax, looking at stamp duty, looking at the land tax trade-off. That's all welcome work for them, and it's their body of work for decisions that they may take.
On Monday is the Australians' Strategy Day. I just wondered your reflections, you're a keynote there, your reflections on the current Australia-China relationship, which of course has been reasonably tense in recent times.
Well, it's a key relationship. They're our number one trading partner. Last year, over $200 billion of two-way trade. A third of our exports make their way to China. And since we entered into that free trade agreement in 2015, we've seen not only a boost in agricultural and resource exports, but also seen a boost in service exports. And they're really good opportunities for us. But there will be times when we differ with China, just as we'll differ with our other friends and partners. But in terms of that relationship, it's absolutely vital that it continues to be in good shape. And when it comes to the United States and China and their trade tensions, our messages publicly are the same as our messages privately. Namely, we want the parties to come together to negotiate their differences, to ameliorate those tensions, and to ensure their commitment to an open, transparent, rules-based trading system, because that's in Australia's interest. With 1 in 5 Australian jobs connected to trade, we want to see a stable trading economic environment around the world, which will benefit many people here in Australia as well as many people overseas.